Our next speaker is Sir Roland Jackson, a visiting fellow of the Royal Institution London, where Tindall also spent most of his career. He was head of museum at the Science Museum and was chief executive of the British Science Association. Tindall was its president in 1874. Roland is a keen mountaineer and has ascended many of the same peaks as Tindall himself. Roland is also a general editor of the Tyndall Correspondence, and in 2018 he published the first biography of John Tyndall since 1945, which was published in paperback this week.
It's a great privilege to be here talking to you today, and I'm only sorry that I can't be with you in person. Imagine it's about 160 years ago, in fact February in 1860, and picture a slight man of medium height with light brown hair and grey-blue eyes and an air of restless, nervous energy enter the hallowed portals of the Athenaeum Club in London. John Tyndall, for it is of course he, in his late 30s, has just been elected. He was proposed by Sir Roderick Murchison, the Director General of the British Geological Survey and Director of the Royal School of Mines, and seconded by Thomas Bell, the surgeon, zoologist and Vice President of the Royal Society. It was already a remarkable rise into society, that almost all his important work was still before him. Perhaps the ultimate recognition of his social standing came 10 years later, in March 1871, when he received a letter from the Lord Chancellor, Lord Hatherley, informing him of his election to the club, that exclusive dining club of 34 men, which included the Archbishop of Canterbury, Gladstone, the Duke of Argyll, and the Earl of Derby. He joined them and others such as George Richmond, Anthony Froude, and Alfred Tennyson as only the second man of science to be elected. Richard Owen was the first. The rise was indeed extraordinary. Tindall, as we know, was born in Laughlin Bridge around 1822 and just conceivably as early as 1820. Father, a Protestant, Church of Ireland and member of the Orange Order, mother from a Quaker tradition. They were not a rich household, but certainly not impoverished either. After attending the local school, Tindall became an assistant on the Irish Ordnance Survey in 1839, moved to the English Survey a couple of years later, and then became a railway surveyor in the north of England from 1844 to 47, during the massive expansion, also so-called railway mania of the period. All the time he was educating himself through books and by attending lectures at the local mechanics institutes, sufficient indeed to turn himself into a teacher. From 1847 to 1848, he taught here at the innovative Queenwood College in Hampshire, now a ruin, one of the first to introduce the laboratory teaching of science. And then he decided to study for a PhD, which he did from 1848 to 1850 at the University of Marburg in Germany, under Robert Bunsen, among others. There was no such qualification in Britain at the time, and he and his colleague Edward Frankland were the first two men from Britain to study in Marburg. Tyndall's career after this was meteoric. Even before he finished his doctorate, in a mere 2 years and without any prior university education, he was making his name in the abstruse topic of diamagnetism, which is the weak repulsion of materials by a magnet, and which had just been discovered by Michael Faraday. Tyndall's explanation, based on the attraction and repulsion of particles with polarity, differed from Faraday's emerging field theory, which in fact he never accepted throughout his life. But he had the confidence to challenge the great man. Some might say with hindsight that Tyndall was fundamentally wrong, but I don't see it quite like that. Science can offer different valid ways of explaining and modelling the same phenomena, and both Tyndall's and Faraday's approaches are explanatory and quantitatively predictive. This work on magnetism brought him to the notice of Edward Sabine, Treasurer of the Royal Society, who ensured his election as a Fellow of the Royal Society, still Britain's premier scientific body, in 1852. His lecturing skills, honed at Queenwood College, led to a suggestion from his German friend, the physiologist Émile Dubois-Reymond, that he give a prestigious Friday evening discourse to the distinguished society audience at the Royal Institution in February 1853. Even on the dry and challenging topic of diamagnetism, it was an outstanding success. Tindall was appointed Professor of Natural Philosophy almost immediately under Michael Faraday himself, and remained at the Royal Institution until he retired in 1887. Indeed, he took over as superintendent of the laboratory in 1867 on Faraday's death. In the year between being entered into the candidates book for the Athenaeum and being elected as a member, Tyndall made arguably his greatest discovery. He showed that many gases, including carbon dioxide and water vapor, absorb heat, what we now define as long-wave infrared radiation, and that they also radiate heat. Tyndall realized that this explains what we now call the greenhouse effect, and indeed he described it clearly. His work set a critical foundation for our understanding of the greenhouse effect itself, of meteorology, of weather, and of climate. I want to show you here what he said. He wrote, and I quote, "Thus the atmosphere admits of the entrance of the solar heat, but checks its exit, and the result is a tendency to accumulate heat at the surface of the planet." And he continued, "If, as the above experiments indicate, the chief influence be exercised by aqueous vapor, every variation of this constituent must produce a change of climate. Similar remarks would apply to the carbonic acid, that is, carbon dioxide, diffused through the air. Such changes may in fact have produced all the mutations of climate which the researches of geologists reveal." I should add here that the first person to make the possible connection between carbon dioxide and water vapor in the atmosphere and climate change was an American woman, Eunice Foote, a few years earlier in 1856. She didn't, however, detect or explain the greenhouse effect. It's a complicated and controversial story, but I don't have time to go into it here, and it seems likely that Tyndall was not aware of her work. One of the aspects that stands out in Tyndall's work is the relationship between his explorations in a natural environment and in a laboratory. He took inspiration from the glaciers he explored, from the mountain landscape and weather, from the clouds and atmosphere. And with great experimental skill, to my mind, he was one of the outstanding experimentalists of his generation. He probed the underlying physics in his laboratory. He was also a superb mountaineer, making the first ascent of the Weisshorn, here in the middle of the picture, one of the highest and most beautiful peaks in the Alps, and the first traverse of the Matterhorn, peeping out just behind it, up the Italian ridge and down the Swiss. And here's the Matterhorn from the top of the Breithorn. Tyndall climbed up the left-hand ridge, the Italian ridge, and down the right. The breadth of his work is astonishing, and I don't for a moment suggest that you should read this slide in detail, simply experience, if you like, its range and the connectedness of his science. It ranges through magnetism, glacier structure and motion, the absorption and radiation of heat by gases, light scattering and light-induced chemical reactions, the transmission of sound in the atmosphere, and even the germ theory and disproof of the idea of spontaneous generation of life, in which he worked closely with Louis Pasteur. He was the first person to give a clear explanation of why the sky is blue, in terms of the preferential scattering of blue light, and the scattering of light from colloids is called the Tyndall Effect to this day. This discovery led him to the wonderful image, "We live in the sky, not under it. Scattering is happening all around us," a phrase that seems to have occurred to him in making an ascent of the Allertshorn in the Bernese Oberland, seen here in this picture. Many other things are named after him: the Tyndall Centre for Climate Research, the Peak Tyndall on the Matterhorn, which he reached in 1862, the highest point attained until the triumph and tragedy of Whymper's ascent in 1865, Mount Tindall in the Sierra Nevada and Tasmania, several glaciers, and craters on the Moon and Mars. And then there is the Tyndall National Institute in Cork, specialising in electronics and photonics. This last one is interesting. For many years, despite an Irish accent, and perhaps particularly as a result of his vitriolic anti-Catholicism and opposition to Gladstone's Home Rule policy, his legacy was largely ignored in Ireland. Like George Stokes and others born in Ireland and making careers in Britain, he was not really considered Irish in some respects, and was not properly reclaimed as Irish until relatively recently, and thanks, of course, to the efforts of many people in and around Carlow. Yet he had extensive interactions with Ireland throughout his life, supporting his extended family financially. Indeed, it seemed to expand the richer he became, visiting the scientific meetings and walking holidays, and working for many years as scientific advisor to the Board of Trade on lighthouses, including those around the coast of Ireland. Like Faraday, whose positions he effectively inherited, he had a parallel career as a scientific advisor to government. He became, especially after Faraday's death, and the timing is perhaps not coincidental, one of the most visible public intellectuals of his age. At the Royal Institution, he was an outstanding lecturer to that high society audience, and a writer of popular but by no means simple science books. Inside the Royal Institution, he kept to scientific matters. But outside, it was a very different affair. His was one of the loudest voices, alongside his friend Thomas Huxley, in advocating a scientific explanation for the natural world and for life itself, a scientific naturalism. In this, religion and theology had no place. It was not their domain. To appropriate Stephen Jay Gould's term, they were non-overlapping magisteria. For him, the miracles claimed by believers were a nonsense. The natural world ran on natural laws. It would be, he said, as great a miracle to suspend the gravity of a straw as to extinguish the force which holds the solar system together. It was the same for him with prayer. There was no point praying for natural laws to be suspended, for example, for the population to be protected from cholera. Prayer for Tindall had a different inward function. I should add that in publishing these controversial views, Tindall wrote always as from the Athenaeum, not from the scientific body of the Royal Institution. He gave his starkest statement of his position in this famous and indeed notorious Belfast Address as president of the British Association meeting there in 1874. In the Ulster Hall, before a huge crowd, he thundered, "We claim and we shall wrest from theology the entire domain of cosmological theory. All schemes and systems which thus infringe upon the domain of science must, insofar as they do this, submit to its control and relinquish all thought of controlling it." He went on with a striking statement about the nature of matter. "By necessity engendered and justified by science, I cross the boundary of the experimental evidence and discern in that matter which we, in our ignorance of its latent powers, and notwithstanding our professed reverence for its creator, have hitherto covered with opprobrium, the promise and potency of all terrestrial life." So for Tindall, life is an emergent property of matter in complex forms. Life is inherent and potential in matter and matter alone. He left us with this wonderful image. Life is a wave which in no two consecutive moments of its existence is composed of the same particles. Think about yourself at this moment. You are still you, but you do not consist of exactly the same particles as you did when you started listening to me. This image is an example of what Tindall described and promoted as the scientific imagination, the power of the ability to picture unseen entities that nevertheless must be there to explain what we actually do see. Tindall even envisaged the artificial creation of life, arguing as early as 1867, depend upon it. If a chemist, by bringing the proper materials together in a retort or crucible, could make a baby, he would do it. There is no law, moral or physical, forbidding him to do it. I have to say, I still don't understand why that statement did not cause a major public uproar at the time. But he was not an atheist, despite many claiming that he was. Though he started out as a regular Church of Ireland Protestant, he lost his faith in his early 20s and is probably best characterized as a pantheist. He certainly believed in some ultimate power and mystery. And though he absolutely believed in the physical reality of atoms and molecules, with their attractions and repulsions underpinning and sufficient to explain living processes, he wrote that matter is, at bottom, essentially mystical and transcendental. And in a further statement, inspired by his traverse of the Matterhorn in 1868, he wrote, "Did that formless fog contain potentially the sadness with which I viewed the Matterhorn? Did the thought which now ran back to it simply return to its primeval home?" In other words, is consciousness inherent in matter, did Tyndall effectively believe in panpsychism. Consciousness intrigued him, as it still does us all. He saw it as a manifestation of the brain operating under physical processes, and he said that he could hardly imagine that there exists a profound scientific thinker unwilling to accept the extreme probability of the hypothesis that for every fact of consciousness, a certain definite molecular condition is set up in the brain. But he went on, even if we could associate a definite thought and a definite molecular arrangement in the brain, the why would remain as unanswerable as before. The chasm between the two classes of phenomena, say between love and molecular structure, would remain intellectually impassable. But he was never one to belittle the role of religion. Science provided reliable knowledge of the world. Religion met people's emotional needs, a role he thought might eventually be replaced by poetry, when theological beliefs eventually fell away against the march of science. I'm conscious that I've barely scratched the surface of this remarkable man. He was a man of contrasts, driven by a sense of duty and a Protestant work ethic inspired by Thomas Carlyle, but a romantic with a deep regard for poetry, particularly Byron, Shelley, Emerson, and his friend Tennyson. A frequent sufferer from ill health and insomnia, but with immense physical stamina. A staunch friend to many, but a combative enemy in disputes, with the likes of physicists James Forbes, William Thomson, and Peter Tate, along with John Ruskin and William Gladstone for good measure. He was a champion of underdogs, but no Democrat. A loner at times, but a skilled social networker. A superb conversationalist, but he had a limited sense of humour. I've not addressed his views on women or race, neither of which are at all to be admired, even though he personally respected people like John Stuart Mill. He did eventually marry, after 2 failed earlier proposals, and indeed into the aristocracy, to Louisa Hamilton, niece of the Duke of Abercorn, who was the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland at the time. Sadly, she killed him by accident in 1893, giving him an overdose of the wrong medicine in the dark. He gathered huge amounts of material to write a biography, but died no less than 47 years later with it uncompleted. I think that's part of the reason why he's not better known. But he also had the misfortune to die on the cusp of big new discoveries in physics, such as quantum theory and relativity. So in a sense, he represented the past. He was also an experimentalist, if a preeminent one, and it is the theoreticians who tend to get the limelight in physics. But I want to finish with one of Tyndall's poems, indeed his last and best known. And as I should say in passing, I'm glad to be able to say that all Tyndall's extant poetry, some 76 poems, will be published with an extensive introduction in October. Anyway, this last poem, written initially in 1881 up on his Alpine mountain home and inspired by his friend and formative influence Thomas Carlyle, included these lines, inspired, I think, by Emerson's poem, The Rhodora. Whence the craft which shook these gentian atoms into form, and dyed them with an azure deeper far than that of heaven itself on days serene? What built these marigolds? What clothed these knolls with fiery bilberries? What gave the heath its purple blossoms and the rose its glow? Ah, weary head, the answer is abroad, buzzing through all the atmosphere of mind. 'Tis evolution. 10 years later, he published a final version of this poem. Its meaning is now very different, and it captures his beliefs at the very end of his life. Its certainty, and indeed the reference to evolution, is gone. It starts in the same way. Whence the craft which shook these gentian atoms into form, and dyed the flower with azure deeper far than that of heaven itself on days serene? What built these marigolds? What clothed these knolls with fiery whortle leaves? What gave the heath its purple bloom, the alpine rose its glow? But it now continues. Show us the power which fills each tuft of grass with sentient swarms, the art transcending thought, which paints against the canvas of the eye those crests sublime, and then transmutes the picture into worship. Science dumb. O babbling Gnostic, cease to beat the air. We yearn and grope and guess, but cannot know. That, I think, is a suitable place to end with the final words of Tyndall's final poem, indeed his final book. and I thank you for listening. Should you by any chance wish to read more, the paperback version of my biography of Tindall was published by Oxford University Press a couple of weeks ago, and his complete poetry will be published by UCL Press in October. So with that, happy birthday to John, and thank you again for listening.
Thanks so much for that fascinating summary, Roland, of Tyndall's extraordinary life, and wonderful to finish off by reciting some of his poetry too. Without doubt, he achieved so much, and the benefits and knowledge of which still is with us today. Roland runs the Tyndall Twitter account, which you can follow at Prof. Tyndall.
And you're very, very welcome. We have Sir Roland Jackson with us live this afternoon. Hello, Sir Roland.
Hello, pleasure to be here. I'm just only sorry I can't be in Carlow like we'd originally planned, but there you go.
Yeah, well, there was such excitement about your talk and lots of questions flowing in. So if you're watching this, if you have any questions for Sir Roland Jackson in the next couple of minutes, drop them in the Facebook comments box. But we'll start off with Dan McInerney. Hope you're well. Dan's question is, I don't know whether you can see it there, Sir Roland. Is there much evidence as to his religious views, or indeed the lack of them, were received by his colleagues in the Anthem Club? I'll leave that to you.
That's a fascinating question, and one I would say I haven't looked at in detail, but I would say that the majority of people at the Athenaeum were pretty level-headed in their disputes and their sort of discourse, and would have been very well aware of Tyndall's views, in particular because he joined a group called the Metaphysical Society in the late 1860s, which was sort of set up between what you might call believers and non-believers, or different sorts of believers, to try to tease out some of these issues. So his views were well known. I think the discourse would have been polite. And for example, when he gave his Belfast address, and there was such a furore, especially in Ireland, but also in England, about what he'd said, I think it's fair to say that some people on what you might call with very strong religious views deliberately misinterpreted what he said. Others appreciated that he wasn't talking as an atheist, which was not a good idea to be seen as in those days. And the Duke of Argyll, for example, who was a friend of Tyndall's and very religious, wrote a couple of books about religion and science. He privately wrote to Tyndall after that address to say that he fully understood what Tyndall had actually said, and therefore hadn't taken part in any of the outcry. So I think in summary, yes, there would have been lively debate, but he certainly wasn't ostracized.
Okay, I knew someone was going to ask this question, and it's Angela, and I want to know the answer to this question too. So Angela's asked, can you elaborate on his attitude to women, please? Yeah,
certainly. I'm sad to report that he was not a great believer in the creative abilities of women in science, and and I should say that wasn't an uncommon picture at the time, and it goes back to these what we now see as pseudo-scientific beliefs about relative sizes of brains and so on. So his views about the lesser abilities of women extend to race as well, like so many at the time. So he had this curious sort of problem, I think, because he really admired a number of women for their intellectual abilities. So Mary Somerville, the great scientific writer, he admired greatly, and they had an arranged correspondence. He was friends with very intellectual women. I think of Juliet Pollock in particular, who wrote 30 or 40 pieces anonymously in the quarterly journals on matters of literature, and yet he could still think that women were not capable of the same scientific insight as men. And that's even after he married his wife, of course, late in life. And she did quite a bit of work for him. They worked together in the laboratory. She would tabulate boiling points of liquids and things like that. but he never put her name on a paper, even though she contributed to the work, one would say today. And she clearly also regretted the fact that her social situation had not allowed her to do as much as she might have wanted to do. So, as I say, I'm sorry to say his views were not admirable. They were common, but not shared by everyone at the time. But that's where he stood.
Sure. Kevin asks. So Kevin's asking, did he actually summit the Matterhorn?
He did indeed. Of course, it was first climbed in 1865 by Whymper and his party, and 4 of them died on the descent. And they went up the Swiss and down the Swiss Ridge. Tindall made about the 7th ascent, so this was in 1868, 3 years later. But at the time he did it, he wanted to do the traverse, so up the Italian ridge, which was the usual way up, and then back down the Swiss. And when he started, as far as he knew, nobody had been up the Swiss route since the first ascent, when 4 of them had died. But he reasoned that since 3 of them had got down alive, it must be possible to get down alive. So quite boldly, he did the traverse up, as I say, up the Italian route, down the Swiss. A great ascent to do, and indeed over the summit at the top.
Flying in the questions. Neve, hello Neve. What role did Tyndall play in education in schools such as laboratory practice?
Right, yeah. That's an interesting one, because he had, of course, taught at Queenwood School and had very much the idea that one should teach science experimentally. That's both by teaching through demonstration and allowing students to follow their own creative ideas. So he was quite a radical, and gave a talk in 1854, was one of a series at the Royal Institution, where he espoused these sort of aims. He was a governor of Harrow's School for a long time, and tried at that time to reform the curriculum to bring more science into it and more practical teaching of science. He didn't, unlike some of his contemporaries, specifically write science textbooks for pupils. He did do some lecturing to training science teachers at the South Kensington Museum, but he wasn't committed, like Huxley, to science education per se in a practical way. Indirectly, I would say he had a great impact, and also through his Christmas lectures and through his accessible science books, he clearly inspired a lot of young people into science.
Super. And then we have Rob. What's the connection with Tindall and Louis Pasteur?
A long and interesting one. At some point, although I wrote quite a bit about them in the Ascent of John Tyndall, I'd like to explore more actually about what they did. But they came into contact at the time when people were criticizing some of Pasteur's work, and when some medics were claiming that disease could arise spontaneously from decaying matter. This is, in other words, instead of having germs, if you like, as a seed of a disease. And Tindall thought that it would be a very bad thing for medical practice if people did not understand that germs do exist, and hence that one should take a germ theory approach to understanding and treating disease. So as he said, if you have typhoid emerging, it comes from the germ of typhoid. It doesn't just arise spontaneously, and that would be like any other aspect of any other living organism. So he worked with Pasteur over quite a long period of time. Their letters to and from between Paris and London coordinate their activities. So Pasteur was attacking people in Paris and Tindall was attacking them in London. And basically they operated a pincer movement with a lot of other people to dismiss the views of the people advocating spontaneous generation.
Quick question is, were John Tyndall's parents connected to science in any way?
Not as far as I'm aware. We know very little about his mother. Actually, we don't know that much about either of them, although Martin Nevin may be able to say a bit more. But his father was well read and had a decent collection of books, but not particularly in science, no.
Okay, interesting. And then were most of John Tyndall's experiments connected with the study of light?
Not most of them, no. I would say that was one particular phase that he went through when he realized that he could cause chemical reactions by using light. And of course, when he discovered light scattering from molecules and other particles and created his artificial clouds, he extended that actually to the theory of comets. So he came up with a theory of cometary behavior based on his series of light and heat absorption. So it was a part of his work for a handful of years, but that was it.
Okay. Just to wrap up, finally, for all John Tyndall achieved, why do we think he isn't better known?
Well, as I said, I think partly because, unlike so many of his contemporaries, he had no life and letters written for him soon after his death. I mean, people like Darwin, Huxley, and others all had big books written about them in the decade or so after they died. Tyndall didn't. And as I said as well, I think his physics was seen, certainly in the 20th century, as a bit old school. It was pre-relativity, pre-quantum theory. He was an experimentalist, and I think it's the theoreticians who tend to get remembered in physics. And sadly, Louisa, desperate to sort of preserve his memory, preserved it for herself until it all ended up in the Royal Institution. And we're now, of course, able to read what he wrote, read her drafts as well of what she wrote for the biography, and come up with our modern interpretations of his life.
Brilliant. Sir Roland Jackson, thank you so much for joining us today. Really, really fascinating stuff. Thank you so much.
Thank you.